"I'm too big to be loved." Obese black girl said. The words rang out in front of the whole town supper, with cruel laughter echoing down the dusty street. But then a giant cowboy stepped forward, towering over every whisper. He took her hand and said, "Not for my arms." The church bell tolled. The townsfolk gasped. And just like that, her life changed forever. Yet behind his promise of love lies a dangerous truth. The railroad is coming for his land, and the only man who can save it is her father, the very one who abandoned her years ago. A father with secrets, and a hidden paper that could destroy them both. Now, as church hymns rise and court doors slam, mercy and betrayal hang in the balance. Can the girl the world called too big to be loved find the courage to face her past, save the man who chose her, and prove that love is stronger than shame? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The lantern light danced across the long wooden tables, casting warm shadows over heaping plates of cornbread and steaming apple pies. Cheerful voices and laughter filled the church hall as neighbors passed dishes and shared stories of summer's end. Pearl Johnson stood near the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched the others celebrate. The smell of fresh baked bread and roasted chicken made her stomach flutter. But it wasn't hunger that had her heart racing. Tom Harlan, with his pressed shirt and polished boots, strode toward her through the crowd. Pearl's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen him watching her all evening, and now he was making his way straight to where she stood alone. "Miss Pearl," he said, tipping his hat with a flourish that made several nearby girls turn to stare. "Would you care to dance? The fiddle?" Music swelled invitingly. Pearl hesitated, her mother's warnings about being too trusting echoing in her mind. But Tom's smile seemed genuine enough, and she didn't want to appear ungrateful. "Thank you kindly," she murmured, accepting his outstretched hand. They hadn't taken 2 steps toward the dance floor when Tom stopped short. His grip on her hand tightened painfully as he raised his voice to carry across the room. "On second thought, you're far too big to be loved. Wouldn't want to risk getting crushed out there." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Pearl yanked her hand free, her cheeks burning as hot as the lantern flames. She stumbled backward, desperate to escape the pointing fingers and whispered comments. Her vision blurred with tears as she turned toward the door, seeking the safety of shadows. That's when heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor behind her. A strong, calloused hand caught hers gently, and a deep voice cut through the commotion like thunder across open prairie. "Not for my arms." Pearl turned to find Boaz McKenna. Towering beside her, his broad shoulders squared against the crowd's judgment. Trail dust still clung to his coat. He must have just returned from driving cattle. His blue eyes met hers with quiet determination. "Miss Pearl ain't too big for nothing," Boaz continued, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall. "Least of all respect." Tom Harlan's face reddened. "Now see here, McKenna, I see plenty." Boaz cut him off. "I see a man who needs to learn some manners." He turned to Pearl, his expression softening. "Would you like some air, Miss Pearl? These lanterns are mighty warm tonight." Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Boaz tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her toward the door. The crowd parted before them, like water around a boulder. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Pearl heard the whispers start up behind them. But Boaz's steady presence made them easier to bear. They walked in silence until they reached the church steps. The October moon hung low and full over the prairie, painting silver paths across the grass. Pearl drew in a shaky breath, finally finding her voice. "You didn't have to do that, Mr. McKenna." "Boaz," he corrected gently. "And yes, I did. Man. Can't stand by while cruelty's being done. Not if he wants to sleep sound at night. Pearl studied his weathered face in the moonlight, searching for any sign of mockery or false kindness. She found none. "Most folks don't trouble themselves about me," she said softly. Most folks are fools, then. Boaz's words were simple, but firm. "Would you allow me to walk you home?" Night's getting on. Pearl hesitated. Her small cabin sat at the edge of town, and she usually hurried home alone after her laundry work was done. But something in Boaz's steady gaze made her nod. "Thank you. I'd be much obliged." They walked slowly down the dusty street, the sound of celebration fading behind them. Boaz matched his long stride to her shorter one, never rushing or pulling ahead. When they passed the general store, he spoke again. "Been gone 3 months on the cattle drive. Seems some things haven't changed much here in Willow Rock." "Some things never do," Pearl replied, thinking of the sideways glances and whispered comments that followed her daily rounds. "Some things should," Boaz said firmly. After a moment, he added, "I remember your mama's singing, you know, used to fill this whole town with glory every Sunday morning." Pearl's heart tightened at the mention of her mother. "You knew her?" Everyone knew Sarah Johnson's voice. The way she'd lift up them hymns made a body believe in angels walking the earth. He glanced down at her. "You got her gift, I hear tell." Pearl clutched her shawl tighter. "I don't sing much anymore. Not since." She trailed off, remembering the empty chair beside her bed. The silence where her mother's lullabies used to be. "That's a shame," Boaz said quietly. "World needs more beauty in it, not less." They reached Pearl's cabin. It's small, window dark against the star-filled sky. Pearl turned to face him, struggling to find the right words. "Mr. McKenna Boaz, did you really mean what you said?" Back there at the church, Boaz's eyes were serious in the moonlight. "Every word. Any man worth his salt would be proud to stand beside you, Miss Pearl. Don't let nobody tell you different." Tears pricked at Pearl's eyes again, but these were different from the ones she'd fought back earlier. "Thank you," she whispered. "No thanks needed for speaking truth." He tipped his hat. "Get some rest now, and don't let them steal your song." Pearl watched him stride away, his tall figure merging with the darkness. Inside her cabin, she lit a small lamp and pulled her mother's worn hymn book from its shelf. The pages fell open to her favorite psalm, the one about joy coming in the morning, sinking onto her narrow bed. Pearl traced the familiar words with trembling fingers. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet night, "help me believe what he said. Help me be strong like Mama was." Oh. The moonlight streamed through her window, making the pages glow silver. For the first time in months, Pearl felt something stir in her chest, something that felt almost like hope. Pearl woke while stars still dotted the dark sky. She pulled her shawl tight against the pre-dawn chill and gathered her washing supplies. The sturdy scrub board her mother had left her, a bar of lye soap and worn rags for scrubbing. The wooden pail's handle creaked as she lifted it, heading toward the river where she did her washing. The eastern horizon showed just a hint of pink as Pearl made her way down the well-worn path. Her boots crunched on fallen leaves, and morning birds called sleepily from the cottonwoods. She tried not to think about last night, about Tom Harlan's cruel words or Boaz McKenna's unexpected kindness. Such thoughts would only lead to heartache. Other washerwomen were already at work when Pearl reached the river. She could hear their voices carrying over the sound of rushing water as she approached her. Usual spot, Mrs. Burton and Miss Adelaide knelt at the water's edge, dunking shirts and sheets into the current. "Morning," Pearl said softly. Setting down her supplies, the women's conversation hushed for a moment before picking up again, louder this time. Pearl kept her head down as she arranged her scrub board, but their words reached her clearly enough. "Did you hear about that scene at the church supper?" Mrs. Burton asked, wringing out a shirt with more force than necessary. "That McKenna fellow. Making such a display." "Oh yes," Miss Adelaide replied. "Oh, I can't imagine what he was thinking. A man like that, with his own ranch and all. Surely he was just being charitable." Pearl's hands trembled as she dipped a sheet into the cold water. The soap slipped through her fingers, and she had to grab for it before the current could steal. It away must have been charity, Mrs. Burton agreed. Or maybe he's got something else in mind. Men like that, sometimes they think they can take advantage. Pearl's cheeks burned. She scrubbed harder at the fabric, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of work. But their words wormed their way into her mind, feeding the doubts that had plagued her all night. Why would a man like Boaz McKenna show her kindness? What did he want in return? The morning wore on, sun climbing higher as Pearl worked through her pile of laundry. Her back ached from bending over the scrub board, but she welcomed the pain. 'Twas better than thinking about last night, about the warmth in Boaz's blue eyes or the gentle way he'd held her hand. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Her heart jumped when she recognized the rider approaching, Boaz himself. Mounted on his big bay horse, Mrs. Burton and Miss Adelaide fell silent, watching with undisguised interest as he dismounted. "Morning, ladies," Boaz called, touching the brim of his hat. He carried a cloth-wrapped bundle under one arm as he made his way down the bank. "Miss Pearl, I brought you something from town." Pearl stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She was aware of the other women's eyes on her as Boaz approached. "Noticed your soap was running low yesterday," he said, holding out the bundle. "Thought you might need some supplies." Pearl unwrapped the cloth to find 2 bars of Good Lye soap and a new scrub brush. Her throat tightened at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you, Mr. McKenna. But you didn't have to, Boaz," he reminded her gently. "And it's no trouble." He glanced at the pile of washing still waiting to be done. "Hard work, you do here. It puts food on the table," Pearl said quietly. Boaz nodded, understanding in his eyes. Speaking of food, he shifted his weight, suddenly looking less sure of himself. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper tonight, at the boarding house." Pearl's heart stuttered. She was aware of Mrs. Burton and Miss Adelaide pretending not to listen while hanging sheets nearby. I don't know if I should." "Just supper," Boaz said firmly. "Nothing improper about breaking bread together." Pearl thought of the women's earlier words about charity and taking advantage. But looking at Boaz's open, honest face, she couldn't find any trace of cruel intentions. "All right," she heard herself say. "Thank you. 6 o'clock. When she nodded, a smile spread across his face. "I'll look forward to it then." He touched his hat again and mounted up, riding back toward town. Pearl turned back to her washing, trying to ignore the meaningful looks Mrs. Burton and Miss Adelaide exchanged. She focused on her work, but her mind kept drifting to thoughts of the evening ahead. The boarding house dining room was warm and bright when Pearl arrived that evening. Her best dress smoothed carefully over her worn petticoats. Boaz stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her at a corner table. "You look lovely," he said, simply as she sat down. Pearl smoothed her skirts, fighting the urge to hide her face. "Thank you for asking me to supper." Mrs. Wilson, the boarding house owner, brought them each a bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. The rich smell made Pearl's stomach growl. She'd been too nervous to eat much all day. "How was your day?" Boaz asked as they began to eat. "Besides the washing, I mean?" "Quiet enough," Pearl replied. She stirred her stew, gathering courage. "May I ask why you invited me here tonight?" Boaz set down his spoon. "Because I enjoyed talking with you last night, 'cause you seem like someone worth knowing better." He met her eyes steadily. "No hidden reasons, Miss Pearl, just that." Before Pearl could respond, quick footsteps approached their table. A ranch hand, Pearl recognized him as one of the men who worked Boaz's spread, hurried up with a yellow envelope in his hand. "Sorry to interrupt, boss," he said, "but this telegram just came for you. Marked urgent." Boaz took the envelope with a frown. As he read the message inside, his expression darkened. "When did this arrive?" he asked the ranch hand. "Just now. Came straight from the telegraph office." "All right." "Thank you, Jim." Boaz waited until the man left before looking back at Pearl. "I'm sorry, but this is troubling news. Is everything all right?" Pearl asked. Boaz leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The railroad's trying to claim water rights on my family's land. Says they have some prior agreement, but that's impossible. My father and grandfather before him ran cattle on that water. Without it, the ranch can't survive." Pearl's hands tightened in her lap. "What can you do?" "Need to prove our claim predates. There were surveys done, agreements signed." He ran a hand through his hair. But finding witnesses after all these years, Pearl's heart seemed to stop for a moment. When were these surveys done? Must have been 15 years ago, thereabouts. Why? Pearl swallowed hard. "My father, he worked for the railroad back then, so surveyor's assistant." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. She hadn't spoken of her father in years, not since he'd abandoned them, leaving her mother to work herself to death, keeping food on the table. Boaz straightened. "Your father? Would he remember the agreements?" "Maybe." Pearl stared down at her half-eaten stew. "I haven't seen him since I was a child. Don't even know where he is now." "But if we could find him," Boaz trailed off, seeing the pain in her face. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask this of you." Pearl closed her eyes briefly. She thought of her mother, working so hard after being left alone. Thought of all the years of hurt and anger. But she also thought of Boaz's kindness, his steady presence, the way he looked at her like she mattered. She began slowly, "I might know someone who could help locate him. In Kansas City, where he used to work." The hope that flickered in Boaz's eyes made her chest ache. "Miss Pearl, I wouldn't ask you to. I know you wouldn't," she interrupted softly. "It's why I'm offering." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decisions and old wounds hanging between them. Pearl's stew had gone cold, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, wondering if she could face the father who had caused her family so much pain, and wondering if she was strong enough to help the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Pearl lay in her narrow bed, moonlight filtering through the threadbare curtains. Sleep refused to come. Her mother's old hymn book rested on her chest, its familiar weight usually bringing comfort. But tonight, her thoughts churned like the river after rain. Memories of her father rose. Unbidden, Ezekiel Johnson's tall frame bent over railroad. Maps his calloused hands lifting her onto his shoulders, his voice singing deep and low on Sunday mornings. Then came the darker memories, the empty chair at supper, her mother's quiet tears, the endless waiting for a man who never returned. She turned onto her side. Watching shadows play across the cabin wall, the thought of seeing him again made her stomach knot. 15 years of silence stretched between them like a canyon. What right did he have to her help now? As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Pearl gave up on rest. She dressed quickly in the dim light, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill. Her feet carried her toward the white-painted church on the hill, its weathered cross standing stark against the pale sky inside. Dust motes danced in the early light streaming through the windows. Pearl settled onto a worn pew, letting her fingers trail over the smooth wood. Almost without thinking, she began to sing soft and low at first, then stronger. The old hymn filled the empty space, her mother's favorite about grace and mercy. "Beautiful voice you have." Pearl, startled at the deep voice. Boaz stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light. He stepped inside, boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, smoothing her skirts. "I didn't mean to disturb. No disturbance," Boaz said gently. He sat in the pew behind her, leaving respectful distance between them. "Couldn't sleep either." Pearl shook her head. "Been thinking about? About what you said. About my father." Boaz was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking, too, about asking such a thing of you. It isn't right, pushing you toward pain just to save my land. Tell me about the ranch," Pearl said softly. "Why it matters so much." He shifted, leather creaking. "My grandfather built that place with his own hands. Raised my father there, who raised me. Every fence post, every barn board holds memory." His voice grew distant. "But it's more than that. That water, it's life itself out there. Without it, the cattle die. The grass dies, everything we built dies." Pearl closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. "My father, he lives on the edge of town now, in an old line shack I've known for years, but never." She trailed off, twisting, her hands in her lap. "You don't have to do this," Boaz said firmly. Pearl turned to face him. "Yes, I do. Because you showed kindness when others wouldn't. 'Cause sometimes facing old hurts is the only way forward." She stood, gathering her courage. "Will you ride out there with me?" "Of course." Boaz rose. "I'll saddle my horse." The sun was climbing when they set out, Pearl seated behind Boaz on his sturdy Mustang. The town fell away behind them as they followed the old telegraph line that marked the path. Pearl's arms circled Boaz's waist, his solid presence steadying her nerves. They rode past herds of cattle grazing in the distance, their backs dark against the golden grass. The summer heat built as morning wore into afternoon. They stopped once, to rest the horse and share water from Boaz's canteen. "Tell me about him," Boaz asked as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood. "Your father." Pearl plucked a stem of dry grass, rolling it between her fingers. "He was a good man once, I think. Strong, but gentle too. He used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could see over the crowd at church." She tossed the grass aside. "Then the railroad. Work took him away more and more. When he was home, he was different. Distant. One day, he just didn't come back." "How old were you?" 4 years old. Mama worked herself to bone after that, taking in washing, cooking for folks. She never spoke against him, but I saw what his leaving did to her." Pearl's voice caught. "She died when I was 12. Consumption, the doctor said, but I reckon heartbreak played its part." Boaz's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry." Mounted up again, riding on through the afternoon heat. The telegraph poles marked their progress like lonely sentinels. Pearl's anxiety grew with each mile, her fingers tightening in the fabric of Boaz's shirt. The sun was setting when they finally spotted the shack, its weathered boards glowing orange in the fading light. A thin stream of smoke rose from the crooked chimney. Pearl's breath caught in her throat. Boaz reined in the horse, helping her down. "We don't have to do this today," he said softly. Pearl shook her head, unable to speak. Her legs felt wooden as they approached the door. Before they could knock, it creaked open. Ezekiel Johnson stood in the doorway, aged beyond his years. His once proud shoulders were bent, his dark face lined with time and regret. His eyes moved from Pearl to Boaz, then back to his daughter. Recognition and shame twisted his features. "Pearl." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Pearl stood straight, her mother's strength flowing into her spine. "Hello, Papa." Silence stretched between them, heavy with 15 years of absence. Finally, Ezekiel stepped back, gesturing with a weathered hand. "Best come in," he said wearily. "Both of you." Inside Ezekiel's shack, lamplight cast wavering shadows on rough-hewn walls. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the musty smell of Old papers and something deeper, the lingering trace of regret that seemed worked into the very boards. A kettle hung cold over dead ashes in the small fireplace. Pearl stood rigid near the door, arms crossed tight over her chest as if holding herself together. Her eyes darted around the single room, the narrow cot, the scarred table, the stack of newspapers yellowing in the corner. Anything to avoid looking directly at the man who had walked away from her childhood. Boaz's solid presence behind her steadied her trembling legs. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully as Ezekiel gestured toward the two mismatched chairs at the table. "Ain't much," Ezekiel said, his voice rough with disuse. "But please, sit." Pearl remained standing, but Boaz settled into one chair, its legs creaking under his weight. The sound seemed to break something loose in Ezekiel. He sank onto the other chair, his weathered hands splaying on the table surface. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years, and here you stand, girl, looking just like your mama. Pearl flinched at the mention of her mother. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't speak of her. I got no right to. I know that." Ezekiel's shoulders slumped further. "No right to anything where you're concerned. I've failed you both. Failed in every way a man can fail." He reached beneath the table and pulled out a clay jug, setting it between them with trembling fingers. "This here was my companion after I left. Drink enough, and you can forget anything, your wife's tears, your baby girl's face. Forget the shame of running from responsibility." "Why?" The word burst from Pearl, sharp as breaking glass. "Why did you leave us?" Ezekiel's eyes stayed fixed on the jug. Fear, mostly. Fear of not being man enough to provide. The railroad work was drying up. Other men, they had trades, skills. All I had was my back and my willing hands. He drew a shuddering breath. Then the drink got hold of me, made me weak, made me foolish. Your mama tried to help, but I was too far gone in my own misery to let her. Pearl uncrossed her arms, hands clenching into fists at her sides. She worked herself to death, you know, taking in, washing, cooking for strangers. I watched her fade away, and you weren't there. I know. Ezekiel's voice cracked. I know what I'd done. Can't change it now, though Lord knows I wish I could. Boaz cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Johnson, I hate to press on such a painful matter, but there's something we need to ask you about. Something from your railroad days." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "The water rights survey, I remember. Was one of my last jobs before." He gestured vaguely at the jug. "Then you know about the McKenna claim?" Boaz leaned forward, hope kindling in his voice. "I do more than know about it." Ezekiel rose stiffly, crossing to a battered trunk in the corner. He rifled through papers, pulling out a folded document yellow with age. "I signed testimony about it. Saw old man McKenna stake his claim fair and proper. Railroad man had me. Witness it. Write down what I saw." Pearl watched her father's hand shake as he smoothed the paper on the table. The signature at the bottom was bold, written by a younger man who still believed in his own worth. "Would you?" Boaz hesitated, glancing at Pearl. "Would you be willing to stand up in court? Tell what you know?" Silence filled the shack. Ezekiel's fingers traced his signature, years of guilt etching deep lines around his mouth. Finally, he straightened his bent shoulders. "Yes," he said quietly. "Least I can do, after everything. I'll stand up and speak truth, if they'll have my word." Pearl swayed slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Boaz was on his feet instantly, one hand steadying her elbow. "Think we best be heading back," he said softly. "It's a long ride to town." Ezekiel nodded, not meeting Pearl's eyes. "I understand. I'll be ready when you need me." The night air felt clean after the close atmosphere of the shack. Stars wheeled overhead as Boaz helped Pearl mount the horse. She was trembling, though whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't tell. They rode in silence for a while, Pearl's arms locked around Boaz's waist. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves gradually eased some of the tension from her shoulders. When they came to a small creek, Boaz reined in. "Best rest a spell," he said, dismounting and helping her down. "Horse could use a drink." Pearl nodded mutely, watching as he gathered dry branches and quickly built a small fire. The flames cast dancing light across his face as he worked, his movements sure and gentle. When the fire caught properly, he spread his coat on the ground. For her to sit on, Pearl sank down, holding her hands out to the warmth. Boaz settled nearby, giving her space to sort through her thoughts. "My mama," he said after a while. She had faith like a mountain, unmovable. Used to say that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the hurt. It's about choosing to love anyway. Pearl stared into the flames. Did she find that easy to do? "Ma'am," she did not. Boaz smiled slightly, said it was the hardest thing the good Lord ever asked of her. But she believed in it, fierce. Believed that bitterness only poisons the heart that holds it. "Your mama sounds wise," Pearl whispered. She was that. Boaz added another stick to the fire. "Taught me that true strength isn't in never falling. It's in getting back up again." "Sounds to me like your father's trying to do just that," Pearl drew her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. "Maybe so. But 15 years is a mighty long time to wait for someone to stand up straight again." They sat in companionable silence until the fire burned low. The stars had shifted position when they finally mounted up again. Riding on through the cool night toward town, dawn was breaking as they approached Willow Rock, painting the sky in soft pink and gold. Already, Pearl could see curious faces at windows, women gathering at the well with knowing looks. Word traveled fast in small towns, and their overnight absence would set tongues wagging. Some faces showed disapproval, others speculation. But Pearl sat straighter in the saddle, her mother's strength and Boaz's quiet support holding her spine rigid against the weight of judgment. They had what they needed. Her father's testimony might save the ranch. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her. Through the night's confrontation with her past, the county courthouse stood stern and silent in the morning sun. Boaz's boots echoed on the wooden floors as he strode to the clerk's office, papers clutched firmly in his weathered hands. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, peered over his spectacles at the documents, his pen scratching as he recorded the filing. "This L. Halt their claim, temporary like," Peterson said, stamping the papers. "But the railroad's lawyers, they ain't gonna take kindly to the delay." "Much obliged," Boaz replied, his voice steady. "That's all I need for now." Outside, Pearl bent over her washtub by the river, scrubbing at a stubborn stain. The morning air carried whispers from the other washerwomen, sharp as thorns. "That McKenna, he's just fooling himself with the big colored girl. Ain't natural." Him spending time with her sort. Pearl's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. She'd heard worse before. The wet cloth twisted in her grip as she wrung it out, pretending the water streaming from the fabric was just river water. Not her own tears. A group of children passed by, pointing and giggling. One boy, no more than 10, called out, "Hey, big." "Pearl, you gonna marry the giant?" His friends doubled over laughing. Pearl kept her eyes on her work, though her cheeks burned. The heavy basket of wet clothes pressed against her hip as she carried it to the drying lines. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only shield. The sun was setting when Boaz's familiar figure appeared at her cabin door. He'd changed into his Sunday best, his dark coat brushed clean of dust. "Evening, Miss Pearl," he said, hat in hand. "Thought you might like an escort to church service?" Pearl's heart jumped, then sank. "I don't know, Mr. McKenna. Folks there, they ain't exactly welcoming to my kind. Then they ain't reading their Bible right, Boaz said firmly. Besides, I reckon the good Lord's house should be open to all his children. His quiet certainty gave her courage. Pearl ducked inside, emerging in her best dress, faded blue cotton, carefully pressed. Her mother's hymnal was clutched tight to her chest like armor. The church windows glowed golden in the dusk. Pearl's steps slowed as they approached, but Boaz's presence beside her was steady as a mountain. Inside, the whispers started immediately. Women bent their heads together, fans fluttering like agitated birds. Men cast sideways glances, some disapproving, others merely curious. They found a pew near the back. Pearl's hands trembled as she opened her hymnal, the pages soft and worn from her mother's touch. The first hymn was announced, Amazing Grace, and the congregation rose. Boaz leaned close, his voice gentle. Your mama taught you to sing, didn't she? Pearl nodded, unable to speak. Then sing for her, he whispered. Sing for the Lord. Don't mind anyone else. The organ wheezed to life. Pearl stood, her knees shaking. The first note came out soft, uncertain. But as the familiar words washed over her, something shifted. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in her memory, strong and true. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound! Her voice deepened, gained strength. It rolled through the sanctuary like summer thunder, rich and powerful. The other voices faltered, then fell silent. Even the organ seemed too quiet, letting Pearl's song soar unfettered to the rafters. Was blind, but now I see. The last note faded into absolute stillness. Pearl opened eyes she hadn't realized she'd closed. The sanctuary was frozen. Every face turned toward her. Then, from somewhere near the front, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the sound spreading like ripples on water. Some faces remained, set in disapproving frowns, but others showed genuine wonder. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. Well now, he said, seems the Lord has blessed us with a mighty fine voice tonight. Pearl felt Boaz's hand brush her elbow, steadying her. She lifted her chin, meeting the stairs directly for the first time. The rest of the service passed in a blur, but she held her head high throughout. After the final prayer, Pearl walked out. Beside Boaz, her steps firm, despite the trembling in her heart. The evening air felt cool on her heated cheeks. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Thank you, she whispered when they reached her cabin. Boaz smiled, his eyes gentle. No need to thank me, Miss Pearl. That voice of yours, that's a gift straight from heaven. After he left, Pearl sat alone in her small room. The tears came then, hot and fast. They were tears of pain for every slight, every whisper, every cruel word. But mixed with the salt was something sweeter, hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing. But just as real, she held her mother's hymnal close, remembering the feeling of the music flowing through her like a cleansing river. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not for the size of her body or the color of her skin, but for the gift God had given her. Outside her window, a whip-poor-will called into the gathering night. Pearl touched the worn cover of the hymnal, her fingers tracing the faded gilt letters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new battles. But tonight, she had found her voice. Tonight, she had stood tall. Tonight, she had sung days stretched into a steady rhythm as summer deepened across Willow Rock, while Boaz spent long hours at the courthouse preparing legal documents. Pearl found herself drawn more often to her father's weather-beaten shack on the outskirts of town. Each visit she brought what she could, spare cornbread wrapped in cloth, fresh water from the well, sometimes even preserved fruit from her small garden. At first, their conversations moved as slow as molasses, filled with long silences and careful words. Ezekiel would sit in his crooked chair, his worn hands folded in his lap, while Pearl perched on an upturned crate near the door. But gradually, like a creek thawing after winter, words began to flow more freely between them. "Your mama, Ezekiel," said one afternoon, his voice rough with memory. "She always said you had her singing voice. Used to rock you and hum them old spirituals." Pearl's throat tightened. "I remember." She never missed a Sunday service, even when she was ailing. The shadows lengthened across the packed dirt floor as Ezekiel's expression darkened. "There's something you ought to know, girl, 'bout them railroad days." Pearl leaned forward, watching. Her father's face. "Them railroad men," he continued, his words coming slower now. "They wasn't kind to freedmen like me who worked the surveys. Used threats to keep us quiet about what we saw." His hands twisted together when they was marking. "Water claims, cutting up the land wrong, we knew it. But they'd tell us our families might have accidents if we spoke up." Anger flared in Pearl's chest, hot and sudden as a prairie fire. "So you ran, left Mama and me alone because you was scared." "I was weak," Ezekiel admitted, his voice breaking. "Couldn't face your mama after what I'd done. The shame of it drove me to drink." And then he gestured helplessly at his shabby surroundings. Pearl stood abruptly, her hands clenched. The hurt of abandonment, buried so long, burned fresh again. She strode toward the door, but Boaz's words from earlier that week echoed in her mind. "Forgiveness ain't about forgetting the hurt. It's about choosing to love anyway." She paused, her hand on the rough wooden doorframe. Behind her, she heard her father's ragged breathing, heavy with unshed tears. "I'll bring more cornbread tomorrow," she said quietly, not turning around. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. As Pearl walked the dusty path away from Ezekiel's shack, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Clay Dobbs rode up, his lean face twisted in a familiar sneer. He reined his horse across her path. "Well, if it ain't the giant's pet," he drawled, looking down at her. "What's a big girl like you doing out here all alone?" McKenna finally come to his senses. Pearl tried to step around his horse, but Clay shifted to block her way. "You know what I reckon?" he continued, his voice cruel. "I reckon McKenna's just using you to get your daddy's testimony. Ain't no real man would want. That's enough, Dobbs." Boaz's deep voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. He sat astride his bay gelding a few yards away, his expression hard as granite. Clay's hand twitched toward his gun belt. But Boaz was already dismounting, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You've got something to say?" Boaz said quietly. "Say it to me, direct." Clay's swagger faltered slightly at Boaz's approach. The smaller man's horse danced nervously, picking up its rider's tension. "Just having a friendly chat," Clay said, but his voice had lost its edge. No harm meant. "There's harm in every word you speak to this lady," Boaz replied. "Right on. And don't let me catch you bothering her again." Something dangerous flickered in Clay's eyes, but he wheeled his horse around. "You can't watch her every minute, McKenna," he called over his shoulder as he rode away. Pearl released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Boaz turned to her, his stern expression softening. "You? All right." She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "Come on," he said gently. "I've got beans cooking at my line shack. You look like you could use a proper meal." The ride to Boaz's small cabin took them through rolling grassland painted gold by the setting sun. Inside, a pot of beans simmered over, the fire filling the one-room shack with savory warmth. Boaz added more wood to the flames while Pearl stood uncertainly near the door. "Sit," he said, pulling out a sturdy chair, "and eat your fill. No holding back here." Pearl hesitated. All her life, she'd been conscious of her size, of taking up too much space, of eating too much in front of others. But Boaz's steady gaze held no judgment, only kindness. He filled 2 tin plates with steaming beans and cornbread, setting one before her. "My mama always said food tastes better shared," he said, settling into his own chair. They ate in comfortable silence as darkness gathered outside. The fire crackled softly, and Pearl felt the day's tension slowly unwinding from her shoulders. After the meal, Boaz insisted she take the chair near the hearth while he cleaned up. The flames danced hypnotically, and Pearl found her eyes growing heavy. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe, truly at peace. The last thing she remembered was Boaz draping a warm blanket over her shoulders as she drifted into sleep by the fire. "Rest easy," she heard him murmur, his voice as gentle as a prayer. "You're safe here." And she was. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Rock's main street as Pearl balanced her wash basket against her hip. The mercantile's bell chimed. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the familiar scent of coffee beans and leather. She needed soap for the week's washing, and perhaps a bit of thread if she could spare the coins. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, was deep in conversation with a stranger at the counter. The man's suit was city-cut, his boots too shiny for prairie dust. Pearl moved quietly toward the soap barrel, but the stranger's words caught her attention like a hook. "These water rights cases are quite straightforward," the man was saying, his voice smooth as polished glass. "Missing affidavits have a way of surfacing at opportune moments." Pearl's hands stilled on the soap. Through the gaps between shelf items, she watched Mr. Henderson shift uncomfortably. "That McKenna boy seems mighty sure of his claim," the shopkeeper replied. The stranger, clearly a railroad lawyer by his bearing, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with a practiced smile. "Certainty can be a dangerous thing, especially when built on incomplete information." He placed a few coins on the counter. "Good day, sir. Do let me know if you hear anything useful about the McKenna situation." Pearl pretended to study fabric. Bolts as the lawyer passed by, her heart hammered against her ribs. Missing affidavits. What could that mean? She hurried through her purchases, mind racing. The morning's washing would have to wait. She needed to speak with her father. The walk to Ezekiel's shack seemed longer than usual, each step heavy with dread. Pearl found him outside, attempting to mend a broken chair in the weak autumn sunlight. He looked up at her approach, his weathered face creasing with concern at her expression. "What's troubling you, girl?" he asked, setting aside his tools. Pearl didn't mince words. "There's a railroad lawyer in town, talking about missing affidavits." She watched her father's face carefully. "Is there something you ain't told us, Papa?" The effect was immediate. What little color remained in Ezekiel's cheeks drained away. His hands began to tremble. "Papa," Pearl pressed, her voice rising. "What aren't you saying?" Ezekiel sank onto his half-mended chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "I hoped," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this." "Come to what?" Pearl demanded, though fear already coiled in her stomach like a rattler about to strike. There was another paper. The words seemed to pain him physically. "After the first affidavit, supporting McKenna's claim, they came to me. Railroad men. Said if I didn't sign their paper, saying different," he shook his head, shoulders slumping. "They knew where you and your mama lived, what time she walked to church, what time you played in the yard." Pearl staggered back as if struck. "You signed away Boaz's water rights to protect us." "I was weak," Ezekiel whispered. "Always been weak. Signed their paper, then couldn't face what I'd done. That's when I started drinking. When I left," his voice cracked, "your mama never knew why. I couldn't tell her I'd sold my honor to save you both." Pearl's vision blurred with tears of rage and hurt. All these years, she'd thought he'd abandoned them from simple cowardice. But this was both better and worse. He'd tried to protect them, but in doing so, He'd created a weapon that could now destroy Boaz's ranch. "We have to." "Tell him," she said finally, her voice thick. "Boaz needs to know." As if summoned by his name, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Boaz appeared around the bend, riding tall in the saddle. He dismounted quickly at the sight of their faces. "What's happened?" he asked, striding forward. Pearl couldn't speak. Looked at her father, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few minutes. "I signed to papers," Ezekiel confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "One true, one false. The railroad, they threatened my family. I was too afraid to stand against them." He raised haunted eyes to Boaz. "The second affidavit gives them rights to the water." All of it. Boaz stood very still, absorbing this. Pearl waited for anger, for disappointment, for rejection. Instead, he simply asked, "When?" 19 years back, Ezekiel replied. "Just before I left." Boaz nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Railroad was pushing hard then, trying to secure water access for their steam engines." He looked at Pearl, his eyes gentle. "This changes nothing about how I see either of you. But your ranch Pearl started. We'll fight with truth," Boaz said firmly. "Your father was coerced. That second affidavit was signed under duress." Number? Courtworth at Saltwood. A harsh, racking cough interrupted him. Ezekiel doubled over, his whole frame shaking with the force of it. Pearl rushed to her father's side as he gasped for breath, his lips taking on a bluish tinge. "Papa," she cried, supporting his shoulders as another coughing fit seized him. "Boaz, help me get him inside." Together, they half-carried Ezekiel into the shack, laying him on his narrow bed. His breathing came in ragged wheezes, years of railroad coal dust claiming their toll. Pearl pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, while Boaz filled a tin cup with water. Through it all, Pearl's mind spun with the morning's revelations. The second affidavit hung over them like a storm cloud, threatening everything they'd worked toward. But watching her father struggle for breath, she realized some things mattered more than water rights and legal claims. She took Ezekiel's trembling hand in hers. And for the first time in 19 years, she truly held her father's hand, not with resentment, but with love. The doctor's boots creaked against the floorboards of Ezekiel's shack as he packed away his stethoscope. His weathered face held the grim expression Pearl had dreaded since her father's collapse. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty window. "I won't deceive you, Miss Johnson," Dr. Matthews said quietly. Years of railroad work, the coal dust, the drink, they've taken their toll. His lungs are failing, and his heart's not far behind. Pearl gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. How long? Days, maybe, a week at most. The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Make him comfortable. That's all we can do now." After he left, Pearl sank into the chair, staring at her father's sleeping form. Ezekiel's breathing came in shallow wheezes, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. The strong man who had once lifted railroad ties now looked frail as autumn leaves dot heavy boots on the porch announced Boaz's arrival. He ducked through the doorway, arms laden with supplies, blankets, medicine, food from the mercantile. His eyes met Pearl's, reading the doctor's verdict in her face. "I'm staying," she said firmly, before he could speak. "He needs tending." Boaz nodded, setting down his burdens. "I'll bring more supplies tomorrow, whatever you need." Days blurred together as Pearl kept her vigil. She heated broth, changed sweat-soaked sheets, and measured doses of medicine that brought little relief. Boaz came daily, sometimes just sitting quietly while she dozed in the chair beside her father's bed. During his lucid moments, Ezekiel's eyes followed Pearl around the small room, filled with a desperate sadness. Late one afternoon, as she spooned broth between his cracked lips, he caught her wrist with trembling fingers. I was too weak, he whispered hoarsely. Too weak to be the father you deserved. His eyes welled with tears. Running instead of standing firm. Drinking instead of providing. Leaving you and your mama alone. Pearl's hand tightened on the spoon. The old anger rose like bile in her throat. Memories of hungry winters, of her mother working herself to exhaustion. Of cruel words from townspeople about the abandoned colored family. You were a child, Ezekiel continued, his voice breaking. My child. I should have protected you proper, not with cowards' choices. He coughed, the sound wet and rattling. Can you ever forgive such a father? Pearl set down the bowl, her hands shaking. Part of her wanted to pour out 19 years of hurt, to let him feel the full weight of his abandonment before he slipped away. But looking at his ravaged face, she saw something new. Not the frightened man who had fled, but one crushed by the knowledge of his own failures. I don't know, she answered honestly. I'm trying. He nodded weakly, accepting this small mercy. That night, as the lamp burned low and shadows danced on the walls, Ezekiel stirred from a troubled sleep. Pearl, he called, his voice barely a whisper. I'm here, Papa. Would you sing for me? That hymn your mama loved so much, Amazing Grace. His eyes were fever bright. She had such a voice. Your mama? Like angels singing, Pearl's throat tightened. She hadn't sung that hymn since her mother's funeral, had locked away those memories. Like precious china, too painful to touch. I don't think I can. Please. His hand sought hers in the darkness. Just once more. Pearl closed her eyes, fighting the surge of emotion. Then, softly at first, she began to sing. Her voice trembled on the opening notes, but grew stronger with each word. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, the familiar. Melody filled the small shack, wrapping around them like a worn quilt. Ezekiel's labored breathing eased slightly as she continued, his grip on her hand relaxing. By the final verse, tears streamed freely down Pearl's cheeks. But she sang on. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. The last note faded into silence. Ezekiel's eyes had drifted closed, a peace settling over his features that Pearl had never seen in life. She sat holding his hand through the long hours until dawn, singing softly whenever his breathing grew troubled. As the first gray light crept through the window, Ezekiel drew one last shuddering breath. Then stillness. Pearl felt the moment his hand went slack in hers, when the spirit fled the broken body that had carried so much pain. Papa, she whispered, though she knew he was gone. Papa. Grief crashed over her like a flash flood, sweeping away all the careful walls she'd built. She laid her head on his still chest and wept for the father she'd lost twice now, for the reconciliation barely begun, for all the words left unsaid between them. That's how Boaz found her when he arrived with the morning supplies. Without a word, he gathered her into his arms, letting her sob against his chest while the sun rose over the prairie. Her tears soaked his shirt as she cried out 19 years of hurt, of anger, of loss. He tried to protect us, she choked out between sobs in his way. But he was so afraid. I know, Boaz murmured, stroking her hair. I know. Pearl pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. What do we do now? About the affidavit, the water rights. That's for another day, Boaz said firmly. Right now, we lay your father to rest proper. Everything else can wait. Pearl nodded, turning back to the still form on the bed. In death, the worry lines had smoothed from Ezekiel's face. He looked almost peaceful, as if the weight of his choices had finally lifted. She reached out to touch his cool cheek one last time. Her heart felt torn in two, grieving the father she'd lost while still angry at the one who had left. grateful for their final reconciliation, yet aching for all the years wasted. The truth of his coerced affidavit hung over them like storm clouds, but in this moment, Pearl could only think of his trembling hand in hers as she sang him home. She straightened her shoulders, drawing in a shaky breath. There would be arrangements to make, a funeral to plan. The hard work of grief lay ahead. But for now, she simply stood in the growing morning light, letting the tears fall freely as she whispered a final goodbye to her father. Morning light crept through Pearl's window, but she couldn't find the strength to rise. The previous day's funeral lingered like a heavy blanket, pressing her into the thin mattress. Ezekiel's wooden marker stood fresh in the church cemetery, the dirt still loose around its base. Pearl pulled her quilt tighter, trying to shut out. The World, her mother's hymnal, lay unopened on the bedside table, gathering dust. The thought of singing brought fresh tears. Even the familiar tasks of washing and cooking felt impossible. Her arms weighted with exhaustion and sorrow. A gentle knock at her cabin door went unanswered. After a moment, Boaz's deep voice carried through the wood. "Miss Pearl, I've brought some breakfast." She remained silent, hoping he'd leave. Instead, the door creaked open slowly. Heavy footsteps crossed the plank floor, and the scent of fresh bread filled the small room. "You need to eat something," Boaz said softly. He set a cloth-wrapped bundle on her table, then pulled up her single chair. "Been 2 days since you've had a proper meal." Pearl kept her face turned to the wall. "I ain't hungry. I cannot." Boaz's voice held no judgment. "But your body still needs nourishment. My ma used to say, grief takes more strength than plowing." The mention of his mother made Pearl stir slightly. She'd heard whispers about the McKenna family's loss, sis first. Boaz's father in a cattle drive accident, then his mother to fever a few years later. Slowly, she rolled over to face him. Boaz sat quietly, his large frame seeming too big for her small cabin. Morning sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and worry lines creased his weathered face. "I was about your age when my pa died," he said after a moment. "Couldn't eat for days, just wanted to lay there and let the world pass by." Pearl pushed herself to sitting, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. "How'd you keep going?" "One step at a time." Boaz unwrapped the bundle, revealing fresh bread and a jar of preserves. First step was getting out of bed. Next was eating something. Then doing one small task, then another. He broke off a piece of bread and offered it to her. Grief builds strength, if you let it. Pearl accepted the bread, taking a small bite. The simple act of eating took more energy than she expected. Boaz watched patiently, pouring her a cup of coffee from the pot he'd brought. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, when she'd finished half the bread. "Just to the creek and back. Fresh air might help." Pearl hesitated, then nodded. She dressed slowly while Boaz waited outside. Her black funeral dress still hung on a peg, but she chose her everyday work dress instead. The familiar fabric felt like armor against the world. They stepped out into the morning sunshine. Pearl squinted, unused to the light after days indoors. As they walked through town, whispers followed them like shadows. Some townsfolk nodded. Sympathetically, Mrs. Baker from the Mercantile, old Jim who swept the church steps. Others turned away, their disapproval clear in stiff shoulders and averted eyes. "Don't mind them," Boaz murmured when Pearl tensed at a particularly loud whisper. "People fear what they don't understand." "And what's that?" Pearl asked bitterly. "A colored woman walking with a white man. Or just me being here at all. Change," Boaz said simply. "Makes folks uncomfortable, but that's their burden to bear, not yours." They reached the creek where Pearl usually did her washing. The water burbled peacefully over rocks, carrying away dead leaves and twigs. Pearl sat on a sun-warmed boulder, watching the current. "I keep thinking I see him," she admitted quietly. walking past the window or sitting in his old spot by the church. Then I remember, that's natural. Boaz settled beside her. Took me months before I stopped setting a place for Ma at supper. Grief has its own time. They sat in companionable silence until the sun began to sink. As they walked back through town, Boaz asked, "Would you join me for supper?" At my cabin, a terror. Hesitated, aware of watching eyes. But the thought of returning to her empty cabin with its memories and silence made her shiver. She nodded. Boaz's single quotes ranch cabin sat on a gentle rise outside town, surrounded by grazing land. Inside was simple but neat a cook stove, rough-hewn. Table, few chairs. The walls held only a cross and a faded daguerreotype of a woman with Boaz's kind eyes. They shared a simple meal of beans, bread, and coffee. Pearl ate little, but the familiar routine of passing plates and pouring coffee felt steadying. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with empty words as night settled over the prairie. Boaz lit a lamp and reached for a worn Bible on the shelf. Without ceremony, he knelt beside his chair, hands clasped. Pearl watched, touched by the big man's humble posture. "Lord," he began softly, "we thank you for this day and this food. We ask your comfort for Pearl in her grief. Give her strength to face each morning and peace in her memories. Help her feel your presence, even in the darkest hours." His deep voice continued, asking for guidance and protection. Pearl didn't kneel, but she bowed her head, letting his words wash over her. Though she hadn't prayed since her mother's death, something in Boaz's simple faith touched a long-buried yearning in her heart. When he finished, Boaz rose quietly and walked her home through the starlit evening. At her door, he said only, "Tomorrow's another day, we'll face it together." Pearl nodded, grateful for his steady presence. That night, though tears still came, she felt less alone in her grief. Boaz's prayer echoed in her mind, a reminder that even the deepest sorrow could become a foundation for strength. The weeks after Ezekiel's funeral passed like molasses in winter. Pearl returned to her washing work, hands raw in the creek water, while papers and telegrams flew between Boaz and the county lawyers. Each sunset brought them closer to the hearing date, when Pearl would have to decide whether to speak about her father's secret shame. One evening, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Boaz found Pearl hanging sheets in her yard. The crisp wind snapped the wet fabric like sails. "Railroad lawyers filed their final papers today," he said, helping her secure a wayward corner. Hearing set for next Tuesday at the county seat. Pearl's hands stilled on the clothesline. 2 days' ride from here. Yes, ma'am. I've got the wagon ready." Boaz studied her face in the fading light. "But I won't press you to testify if you're not willing. Daddy signed that second paper because they threatened him." Pearl's voice caught. "Said they'd make sure no colored man ever worked the railroad again if he didn't cooperate. That's why your testimony matters," Boaz said gently. "Shows they acted wrongful, forcing a man to go against his conscience." Pearl turned away, fighting tears. Speaking it in court means everyone knowing. Everyone hearing how weak he was, how he broke under pressure. "No, ma'am." Boaz's voice grew firm. "They'll hear how the railroad bullied a hard-working man, used his race against him. That ain't weakness, that's surviving in a hard world." The wind caught Pearl's skirts as she gathered the last sheet. "When do we leave?" "Dawn tomorrow, if you're willing." Boaz helped her fold the damp cotton. 2 days to get there, time to rest before the hearing. That night, Pearl packed her mother's hymnal and her best dress in a carpet bag. Sleep eluded her as she lay thinking of the courthouse, imagining critical eyes and whispered judgments. But when morning painted the eastern sky purple, she was ready on her small porch, bag in hand. Boaz's wagon rattled up just as the sun crested the horizon. He'd lined the wooden bed with fresh hay and blankets, making a comfortable nest among the supplies. Pearl climbed up beside him on the seat, her heart pounding despite the early hour. They left Willow Rock behind, hooves and wheels raising dust on the trail. The morning air held autumn's bite, promising frost soon. Pearl pulled her shawl closer, watching familiar landmarks fade into distance. Brought some of Mrs. Baker's apple butter for the journey, Boaz said, breaking the silence. And fresh bread. From the boarding house, Pearl managed a small smile. You always think of food. Man can't think straight on an empty stomach. He clicked to the horses. My ma taught me that. They stopped at noon to rest the team and eat. Pearl spread a blanket while Boaz tended the horses. The simple meal of bread, apple butter, and cold chicken tasted better in the open air. They talked little, comfortable in the quiet together. The afternoon stretched long, wheels creaking over. Rutted trails. Pearl dozed against the wagon seat, lulled by the steady motion. When she awoke, the sun hung low and red, painting the prairie grass crimson. Best make camp soon, Boaz said, scanning the horizon. There's a good spot by the creek ahead, sheltered from the wind. They stopped in a grove of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling like whispers overhead. Boaz unhitched the team while Pearl gathered kindling. Soon a small fire crackled, pushing back the gathering dark. Pearl wrapped herself in a blanket, watching sparks rise toward the emerging stars. Across the fire, Boaz's familiar profile reminded her of other evenings they'd shared. His steady presence had become a comfort she hadn't expected to find. Sometimes I still hear Daddy coughing in my dreams, she said softly. See him bent over. That railroad paper, hand shaking as he signed. Boaz added another stick to the fire. Memories have power. But they don't have to cage us. What if the judge doesn't believe me? The fear that had haunted her for weeks spilled out. What if they say I'm lying to help you keep the water rights? Truth has its own weight, Boaz said. Like gold, folks know it when they see it. They shared a simple supper of beans and coffee. As night deepened, coyotes called in the distance. Pearl unrolled her bedding in the wagon bed while Boaz spread his blanket nearby on the ground. Sleep well, Miss Pearl, he said softly. Tomorrow's another day of travel. Pearl lay awake long after Boaz's breathing grew steady. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged since her mother's time, since her father's youth. Their constant light brought an unexpected peace. The second day of travel passed much like the first. They stopped briefly in a small town to water the horses and buy supplies. Pearl felt curious eyes following them, but kept her chin high, drawing strength from Boaz's calm presence beside her. Late afternoon brought them within sight of the county seat. A cluster of buildings rising from the prairie like ships at sea. The courthouse dome gleamed copper in the setting sun. Pearl's stomach tightened at the sight. We'll get rooms at the Western Inn, Boaz said, steering the team down the main street. Simple place, but clean. Owners, a fair man. The innkeeper raised his eyebrows at their dust-covered wagon, but assigned them rooms without comment. Pearl upstairs. Boaz down the hall. After weeks of travel preparations and worry, the reality of tomorrow's hearing pressed close in her small room. Pearl unpacked her good dress and hung it carefully. The black fabric seemed to absorb what little light came through the window. She touched the worn hymnal in her carpetbag, thinking of her mother's strength, her father's broken pride. A knock at her door startled her. Miss Pearl? Would you join me for supper in the dining room? She opened the door to find Boaz waiting, his hair damp from washing away trail dust. Something in his steady presence helped calm her racing thoughts. The dining room was nearly empty at this late hour. They shared a quiet meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Pearl managed only a few bites, her appetite lost to nervousness. Whatever happens tomorrow, Boaz said as they finished. "I'm grateful for your courage in coming this far." Pearl met his eyes across the table. "Truth has its own weight." She echoed his words from the campfire, like gold. That night, alone. In her room, Pearl took out her mother's hymnal. The familiar pages brought comfort as she whispered the words to herself, preparing her heart for tomorrow's trial. Outside her window, crickets sang in the darkness, reminding her that God's world continued turning. No matter what changes morning might bring, the county courthouse loomed before them. Its stone steps worn smooth by years of footsteps seeking justice. Pearl smoothed her black dress, her fingers trembling despite the warm morning sun. Beside her, Boaz stood tall in his best coat, his hat respectfully removed. Inside, the courtroom's polished benches gleamed beneath high windows. Pearl's shoes whispered against the wooden floor as they found their seats. The room filled quickly with townsfolk, ranchers, and railroad men in sharp suits. Their whispers echoed off the walls like rustling leaves. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes swaying as he took his place behind the elevated desk. His gray beard and stern eyes reminded Pearl of her father, making her heart ache anew. "Water." "Rights dispute," the clerk announced. "McKenna Ranch versus Western Railroad Company." The railroad's lawyer rose first, his boots clicking against the floor. Mr. Whitman was a lean man with wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the light. "Your Honor, we have documentation proving our claim." He held up a yellowed paper, a signed affidavit from Ezekiel Johnson confirming the railroad's rights to the water source in question. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Pearl's hands clenched in her lap as Whitman continued. "Mr. Johnson worked the original survey crew. His testimony clearly states that no prior claims existed when the railroad marked these boundaries." Whitman's voice carried triumph. "This document bears his legal mark, witnessed and notarized." Judge Harrison accepted the paper, studying it carefully. "Mr. McKenna, your response." Boaz stood, his voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, that affidavit was signed under duress. The railroad threatened colored workers, especially freedmen like Ezekiel Johnson, forcing them to sign false statements." More whispers filled the room. Pearl could feel eyes turning toward her, but she kept her gaze forward. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. McKenna," the judge said. "Do you have proof?" "Yes, sir, I do." Boaz withdrew papers from his coat. "These are the original water rights, signed by my father and witnessed by 3 men, including Ezekiel Johnson. The dates show. Our claim came first." The judge compared the documents while Whitman scoffed. "Convenient that Mr. Johnson isn't here to verify this story. A man signs 2 conflicting statements, and we're asked to believe the railroad forced him. Where's your witness?" Pearl's heart pounded. Before she knew what she was doing, she had risen to her feet. "I am his witness, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison peered at her over his spectacles. "And you are?" "Pearl Johnson, Your Honor. Ezekiel was my father." Her voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. "He passed 2 weeks ago, but he told me the truth before he died." "Objection," Whitman cut in. "This is hearsay from a deceased man's daughter. I'll hear her out," the judge decided. "Proceed, Miss Johnson." Pearl took a deep breath, feeling Boaz's supportive presence behind her. "My father worked the railroad surveys when I was small. He was proud of that work at first, earning honest wages, helping build something important." She paused, steadying herself. "But the railroad men, they started pressuring the colored workers, said they'd make sure no freedmen ever worked the rails again if they didn't cooperate." She could see her father's face in her mind, worn and ashamed. Daddy signed that second paper because he was scared, because he had a family to feed. He carried that shame until the day he died. Whitman stood again. "Your Honor, this is mere sentiment. My father wasn't perfect, Pearl continued, her voice rising above his objection. He left us when times got hard, turned to drink. But at the end, he tried to make things right. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her mother's worn hymnal. My mama used to sing from this book. One verse says, "Truth and mercy meet together. Righteousness and peace embrace." The courtroom was absolutely still now. Even Whitman had fallen silent. Daddy told me the truth about both papers before he died. He signed the first one honest, witnessing the McKenna family's claim. The second, her voice caught, but she pressed on. The second was signed in fear and shame. That's the truth of it, Your Honor. And I reckon both truth and mercy matter in your court. Judge Harrison studied her for a long moment. Thank you, Miss Johnson. He turned to the lawyers. I'll need time to consider all aspects of this case. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for my decision. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room. As people began to stir and talk, Pearl remained standing, her mother's hymnal clutched tight against her chest. She felt drained, as if she'd worked a full day at the washtubs. But something like peace settled over her heart. Boaz touched her elbow gently. Let's get some air, he murmured. They walked out into the afternoon sunshine, leaving the tension of the courtroom behind. Pearl's legs felt unsteady as they descended the courthouse steps. The future hung uncertain before them, balanced between hope and fear, just as her father's legacy now balanced between truth and shame. Your words carried weight in there, Boaz said quietly as they reached the street, like gold. Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Tomorrow would bring the judge's decision, but for now, she had honored both her father's truth and her mother's faith. She had found her voice. Dawn painted the courthouse steps in gentle gold as townspeople gathered, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. Pearl stood close to Boaz, her heart racing beneath her best cotton dress. The crowd parted as they climbed the worn steps, some nodding in greeting, others averting their eyes. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison's gavel brought immediate silence. His weathered face gave nothing away as he cleared his throat. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court finds the second affidavit, signed under duress, to be invalid. His voice filled the hushed room. The original water rights testimony stands. The McKenna Ranch claim is hereby secured. Joy erupted through the courtroom. Hands clapped Boaz's shoulders as Pearl clutched his rough fingers, tears spilling down her cheeks. Mr. Whitman, the railroad lawyer, gathered his papers with tight lips. We'll appeal this decision, he announced sharply. But his words were lost in the celebration as they emerged into the morning light. Several townspeople approached Pearl. Mrs. Baker, who had often whispered behind her hand at the laundry, now offered a tentative smile. Your words yesterday, they showed real courage, girl. Others followed, some with awkward apologies, some with genuine warmth. Tom Harlan's mother couldn't meet Pearl's eyes, shame coloring her face as she hurried past. That evening, Pearl and Boaz walked beneath a sky scattered with stars. The air was sweet with prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Boaz stopped, turning to face her. Pearl, he said softly, taking both her hands in his. My arms have been waiting for you. They'll hold you forever. If you'll have me as your husband. Pearl's tears fell fresh as she nodded, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, the week before the wedding hummed with activity. Miss Sarah from the quilting circle arrived with yards of cream-colored cotton, while Mrs. Thompson brought delicate lace from her own wedding dress. The women gathered in Pearl's small cabin, fingers flying as they stitched her simple gown. Their chatter filled the room with warmth, replacing old prejudices with new understanding. Reverend Matthews visited Pearl one afternoon, his Bible tucked under his arm. They sat on her porch as golden lights spilled across the boards. "The Lord delights in your courage, Pearl," he said, his kind eyes crinkling. "Your testimony showed his mercy at work." Pearl touched the worn hymn book in her lap, remembering her mother's faith. At the ranch, Boaz worked from sunrise to sunset. He swept the cabin floors until they gleamed, patched the roof where winter storms had loosened shingles, and built a new shelf for Pearl's books. Each evening, he knelt in prayer, thanking God for the gift of love found. On the wedding morning, lanterns cast soft light through the church windows. Autumn sunbeams filtered through colored glass, painting rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. The small sanctuary filled with familiar faces, ranchers in pressed shirts, women in Sunday best, children clutching flower petals. Boaz stood at the altar, his tall frame straight and proud in his new black suit. When the door opened, revealing Pearl in her white dress, his eyes filled with tears. She walked forward slowly, her face glowing with joy beneath the simple veil. Her dress, lovingly stitched by many hands, floated around her like morning mist. They joined hands before Reverend Matthews. Their vows rang clear and true through the quiet church. When the congregation lifted their voices in amazing grace, Pearl's rich voice soared above the rest. Joy filled every corner of the sanctuary, warming hearts that had once been cold. The autumn evening painted the valley in soft amber and gold. Pearl sat in the wide rocking chair on the ranch cabin's front porch, cradling her tiny nephew in her arms. Little Samuel, just 6 weeks old, had come to them after her brother's tragic passing back east. The boy's mother had not survived the birth, leaving him truly orphaned. The weathered boards creaked gently beneath the rocker as Pearl swayed back and forth. Boaz's strong arm draped across her shoulders, warm and steady. His presence filled her with peace, just as it had that first night at the church supper months ago. "Look there, little one," Pearl whispered to Samuel, who blinked up at her with dark eyes so like her brother's. "See how the sun makes the river sparkle. That's your home now. Your papa's sister and her big cowboy will keep you safe." Boaz's fingers squeezed her shoulder gently. The water rights were secure now, the appeal dismissed. Their land stretched out before them, a testament to truth's victory over deception. The same river that had witnessed Pearl's lonely days, scrubbing. Laundry now flowed freely through their property, blessing their future. "You know something, Samuel?" Pearl's voice was soft but sure, no longer haunted by old hurts. "Love ain't measured by what folks say about size or shame. It's measured by mercy." She touched his tiny hand. "By arms strong enough to hold what God gives us." The setting sun cast long shadows across the porch as Boaz leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to Pearl's temple. She leaned into his touch, gazing toward the darkening horizon. Her heart was finally, truly at peace. The girl who once fled from cruelty now sat wrapped in love, family, and unwavering faith. Her spirit radiant with hard-won honor. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. Something resonated? Subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.